Hello, class. So today we are going to discuss aggressions and violence. What do you think of when you think about aggressions? Do you think of people fighting each other, gun violence, riots, or there are also other forms of aggressions that are more sort of insidious, less obvious, such as passive aggressiveness, cyberbullying, the silent treatment, all of that are all forms of aggression. So today we are going to discuss all of those. So this is our learning outcome number one. All right, assume you have read the learning outcome. Let's dive into what is aggression. So social psychologists define aggression as a behavior that is intended to harm another individual who does not wish to be harmed. So, aggression is intentional, it aims at causing harm or pain, and the pain can be physical or psychological. And what aggression is not is it's not assertiveness, right? So if you get charged for an item or a bill that you did not order and you refuse to pay, that is being assertiveness. So it's not being aggressive. Also, you might complain to someone. For example, you might complain to a manager about slow services. So that's not necessarily aggression either. And if you accidentally cause harm to others, for example, if a drunk driver run you down and is intentional, then that's not aggression. So aggression has to be intentional and causing harm and pain to others. Violence is a subtype of aggression. Right? Violence is aggressions that um, cause extreme physical harm. All right, so there are two types of aggressions in terms of the cognitive characteristic of it. So there's two types. One type is hostile aggressions, or also called emotional aggressions or impulsive aggressions. So this kind of aggression stems from feelings of anger and aim at inflicting pain. And this kind of aggression is also sort of impulsive, right? There's little forethought to it or intent to it. People, you can think of like an outburst of anger that sort of trigger an aggressive behavior out of someone that they did not intend to have that um, reaction. There's another kind of aggressions called instrumental or cognitive aggressions. Um, so this kind of aggression is intentional and planned. It's aimed to, sort of use aggression as a means to complete an instrumental goal. For example, think about karate chopping somebody. So if you know karate and you karate chop somebody for chewing loudly, that might be more emotional aggression because that person chewing loudly might be really annoying. But if you attend a karate tournament, right, and you try to win, then trying to beat the other persons with aggressions is instrumental because it serves as a mean to the goal, which is being a champion. However, it's not one when someone express aggressive behavior. It's not one or the other. It's not either emotional aggressions or instrumental aggressions. Um, Typically, it's on a continuum, right? So an aggressive behavior might be somewhere between being completely emotional and impulsive and being completely cold and calculating. So a lot of time aggression is somewhere in between the two. There's some coldness calculation plan, and there's also some sort of emotional, uh, negative emotions, for example, anger or hatred. Um, so in terms of the expression of aggressions, there are also two types, which is physical aggressions, um, which is aggressions that cause physical harm and physical pain, and non-physical aggressions, aggressions that use sort of other non-physical means to enact itself. For example, for non-physical aggression, you can think of relational or social aggressions, which include gossiping about somebody, backbiting, spreading false rumor, sunning somebody. So relational and social aggressions use sort of social relationship and manipulate social relationship as a tool to cause harm to somebody, typically emotional harm and social harm to somebody. Um, Non-physical aggressions can also have verbal aggression. So verbal aggression is just a means of, a method of delivering the aggression. For example, swearing or cursing or verbally insulting somebody. There are also cyberbullying is another way that aggression is expressed, but on the cyberspace. So this is an example. Gossip Girl dynamic is probably an example of relational and social aggressions. And there might be some verbal aggressions, but probably there's not a whole lot of physical aggressions going on between the characters in the movie. Um, so, questions for you guys. Do you think physical aggressions is worse or non-physical aggressions is worse? Well, I guess it depends, right? I mean, physical aggression is very, it's obvious. It's definitely caused like very, observable and noticeable harm. Um, but non-physical aggressions is also very harmful and not often sort of like acknowledged. Here's some of the findings and statistics related to non-physical aggressions. You guys don't have to remember these, but I'm just going to show you guys these to sort of highlight the impact of non-physical aggressions. So children who were victims of bullying would experience more depressions, loneliness, peer rejection, and anxiety compared to other children. And 1 in 5 kids would experience this bullying. So 20% of all the kids experiences bullying. Um, for girl, experience non-physical aggressions lead them to be more likely to engage in harmful behaviors later on, such as smoking or even considering suicide. And what really telling is a finding showing that both boys and girls rated social aggressions as making them feel more sad and bad than physical aggression. So, sort of social and verbal bullying is worse for little kids than physical bullying, even. All right, so this is our learning outcome number 2. Feel free to take a few seconds to read it. So, aggressions is intrinsically linked to our biological responses in the fight or flight reactions. So what is fight or flight reaction? So you guys probably pretty familiar with it by now. It's a response one when we perceive threat, and it's true. A major reason for aggression is sometimes not necessarily to inflict harm on other people. It is to avoid being harmed. Right? So people a lot of time become aggressive when they feel threatened. So what do we experience during the fight or flight response? What happened to your body? You might feel your heartbeat faster. Um, you know, you probably have adrenaline dump into your bloodstream, and you feel like your body might start to like mobilize the energy, preparing for a confrontations or an escape, right? Um, so when when we cannot escape, when we cannot flight, our body mobilize the energy to prepare us for the fight reactions, and that's where aggression happens. Aggression is intrinsically linked to the fight or flight reactions that mobilize our energy, activate our body, increase our physiological arousal for a confrontation. Another biological factor that is linked to aggressions is testosterone. So testosterone is the male sex hormone that it does a variety of functions. It's important for development of sexual characteristic or just of the body in men, but women also have a small amount of testosterone. And testosterone is linked to aggressions in both men and women, and in both humans and other animals. And testosterone has been sort of associated with, competitive behaviors, high status, power. Right? If you recall back to a study about power that we discussed in the module about conformity and power, people who were assigned higher status show elevated level of testosterone. Right? So testosterone has to do with it might cause and it's also reflect behavior related to aggression, competitiveness, and dominance. So this graph show the percentage of violent versus non-violent criminals who were in prisons, and for criminals that are lowest in testosterone, right, the majority of them are non-violent, commit non-violent crimes, whereas the criminals who are highest in testosterone, then the majority of them, the vast majority of them, committed violent crimes. So this is a very stark contrast, highlighting the important impact of testosterone. So our biology is also affected by alcohol that lead us to become more aggressive. So what happens when a person is intoxicated? Alcohol typically overall make people become more aggressive when they're intoxicated, even for those people who are not normally aggressive. So what happened? So alcohol first decreased our executive control, and executive controls refer to our cognitive functionings that is in charge of planning, executing plan, and exerting self-control behaviors. Right? So when alcohol decreased our executive control, it also reduced our social inhibitions to sort of maintain our self-image, not doing something that is socially inappropriate. So alcohol basically decrease our self-controls and may lead us to do more extreme behavior. Also, when consume alcohol, people typically experience alcohol myopia. And alcohol myopia, when experienced, is characterized by people being more self-focused and become less aware of the social situations. So, for example, right, normally, if let's say you go to a party and there's police officer nearby, if you remain sober, you probably will notice the police officer. Therefore, you would be reminded that being aggressive is not appropriate or not a good decisions. But if you are under heavy influence from alcohol, you might become more self-focused. You might not notice the police officer. Therefore, we are less aware of the negative outcomes of our aggressions, and therefore more likely to respond aggressively if something happened to us. Regarding emotional factors that lead to aggressions, the textbooks say negative emotions lead to sort of motivate people to be aggressive, but I want to modify that with high arousal negative emotions. So it's not just any kind of negative emotions. If you're feeling sad or if you're feeling depressed, which is an emotional state, you probably feel pretty lethargic and low, not very activated and probably less likely to engage in aggressions. But high arousal negative emotions such as a state of frustrations, anger, or hatred towards somebody is definitely motivating aggressive behaviors. So, but sometimes our aggression is misplaced. You Can you ever think of like an example? You might be able to think of an example where you know maybe one of our friends was feeling frustrated or anger at something else, but they take it out on us. Or maybe we even do that sometime when we're feeling irritating with something, and then we sort of like take it on our friend or our families. Right? So that's called displays aggression. It's when we feel negative emotions towards something else, um, but because we could not express or aggression toward that target, or maybe there's no use in expressing aggression toward that target. For example, if I'm really frustrated with my laptop for acting out, like it's hard for me to like take it out on my laptop, so I might take it out on my roommate instead. So that is called display aggression. So there's this interesting findings regarding the relationship between temperature and aggressions. So it's widely established. It's found that the higher the temperature, the higher the likelihood of aggressions happen. For example, based on this graph, um, with temperature of different locations during different times of the year, the higher the temperature is, the higher the likelihood of a riot that would happen. Well, but you might say, well, wow, that's just correlation between temperature and aggressions, right? And a seminal study by Griffith and Veit in 1971, they assigned participants to two different conditions. So they assigned participants to sort of fill out questionnaires in a normal temperature room versus a room that's really hot, which is 90 degrees hot. And then they take measures from the students to indicate how much they like or dislike other people. And what they find is that the student in the latter conditions express significantly more hostility to others. So generalizing from the relationship between temperature and aggressions, we can see a larger pattern here. Right? It's the relationship between discomfort and aggressions. So this relationship is the same for animal. If an animal is in pain and it cannot flee the scene, it will invariably attack or fight back. So humans likewise will act aggressively when we experience discomfort or pain. And it's not limited to temperature. It could be pain, heat, like temperature, when it's too humid, when there's a lot of air pollutions, when there's an offensive odors. So these any things that sort of create discomfort will likely increase the chance that we will become more aggressive. So this is our learning outcome number 3. Take a few seconds to read them. So let's talk about some ways to deal with, pent up aggressive energy. All right. So what is the catharsis hypothesis? Catharsis hypothesis, refer to the notion that by performing an aggressive act, or watching other engage in aggressive behaviors, or engaging in a fantasy of of aggressions, right? Just imagine acting out on your aggressions, or do some small aggressive behavior that might not be too harmful. Well, so all of those behavior, small active aggressions, um, would release build up aggressive energies, and therefore would reduce further aggressive behavior. So it's basically acting out on your aggressions, but not in a direct way, just in an indirect way to get it out of your system and blow off some steam, and then you'll be good. Later on, you don't have to be aggressive anymore. So, yeah, this idea is pretty popular in pop culture. For example, with the movie The Purge. I don't know if you guys watch it, but the idea is once a year the government allow for any crime to be completely legal, but for the rest of the year, everyone would be like really strict with crimes. So the idea is, well, if we let people to let out their inner demons, right, just commit crime as much as they wanna for one day, then they'll be less aggressive for the rest of the year. Does it really work? So it does work in some way. Um, Many people do feel less angry after blowing off some steam by yelling, cursing, or hitting a wall, or hitting like I don't know, a dummy or something. However, the caveat is does not generally reduce the need for further aggression. So taking out your aggressions by yelling, cursing, or hitting something does not make you less aggressive in the future. Um, in fact, aggressive displays often make participants, or the people who display aggressions, and the observers of the aggressive act become more and more aggressive. So violence begets more violence. So how does researcher test, find out about these? An example is a study on high school football players. So they measure the amount of hostility of high school football player 1 week before the football seasons, and then 1 week after the football seasons. And if the catharsis hypothesis is correct, we would expect that the footballers, right, having taken out their aggressions on the field throughout the year, would become less aggressive at the end. However, the opposite is true. Feelings of hostility actually increase significantly over the season. This catharsis idea is so popular. For example, a lot of people think about watching sport as a way to sort of take out, satisfy, fulfill our aggressive fantasies. However, researchers find that when they look at ice hockey game, the observer or the spectator of the game um, become more and more belligerent and aggressive as the game go on. And toward the end of the final period of the games, the spectators' level of hostility was extremely high compared to when they start, and did not return to pre-game level until several hours after the game was over. So the catharsis hypothesis might sound good in principle, in hypothetical, but in reality, it seems to increase aggression and violence instead of decreasing it. So, what are the alternative for expressing your rage when you get really furious and anger? Here's some suggestion. You can count to 10, breathe, meditate, or otherwise trying to control the physiological aspect of anger. Right? So think back about the fight or flight reactions. It's associated with physiological arousal and mobilizations of body energy in preparations for a confrontation or aggression. So if we sort of interrupt that with breathing, with meditations, with countings, we sort of reduce the urge to be aggressive. we can think about the situation differently, right? So reframing the situations with cognitive restructuring. For example, if we think that, I don't know, my family never understand me or never respect me, um, or my friends always do this mean things to me, then it's really easy to feel hurt, feel angry, and be aggressive. But we can reframe our thoughts, sort of like try to be more objective or take the other person's perspective, or step away and sort of look at the situation from an outsider perspective might change the way you think about the situation and reduce your anger. You could remind yourself that anger is not useful. Figure out what the actual problem is to solve it. You can change your environment, sort of walk away from a situation, from a hot situations that might trigger aggressions. Also help. You can express anger, but calmly and rationally instead of resort to aggressions or violence. Or you can apologize if you realize that you might have overstepped boundary or realize that you have some fault in the situation. All right, so that's some way to, some tips to cope with anger and rage. Here's our learning outcome number 4. Feel free to take a few seconds to read it. All right, so aggression is transmitted through social learning. You are probably very familiar with social learning theory by now. It's the idea that we as children or even as adults learn social behavior, such as aggressions, by observing others and then imitating them or modeling the behaviors. And this, the social learning is illustrated by the Bobo doll studies. So feel free to pause this video and watch the other video to observe how social learning takes place. So knowing that social learning is very important for social behavior in general and for aggressive behavior in particular, upbringing has a especially important effect on aggressions. So researcher has found that the number of spanking a kid receive is correlated with their anti-social behaviors years later. Right? So in this graph, when the kid does not receive, did not get any spank, it has the lowest number of anti-social behaviors. However, the more spanking the kids have by their parents, the more anti-social behavior these kids would express, even 2 years later. So why does this happen? Based on the social learning theory, right? The kids that receive more spanking might have modeled the aggressive behavior of the parents and sort of imitate that and do the same thing, or express some anti-social behaviors to their peers. All right, so let's talk about another social situations that affect aggressiveness. That is TV, violence on televisions. How impactful is violence on televisions? Here's some of the statistics that might highlight how widespread depictions of violence is and how much children are exposed to violence in the media. So 70% of daycare centers in the US show TV on a typical day. The average American TV is on 7 hours a day. So children watch more hours of television each year than they spend in school. That is insane. By the time the average American child finishes elementary school, he or she would have seen 8,000 murders and more than 100,000 other acts of violence. So that is a lot of exposure to violence. And more importantly, Right? 78% of the violence depicted on TV programs did not contain any remorse, criticism, or penalty for that violence. So a lot of times violence are being shown as cool. A lot of protagonists that committed violence did not get punished. They even get celebrated for the violence that they've done. So what is the impact of you know children's being exposed to violence on TV at such a massive scale and with such a high frequency and intensity? Researchers find that watching violence would increase aggression, angry, and hostile thoughts. So this has been found with both correlational and experimental evidence. Watching more violence causes desensitizations to real life aggressions. And what it basically means is that children and adults who watch a lot of violence on TV is less, react less to real life violence, real life aggressions. They sort of become numb to it and get used to it. And watching violence would prime cognitions related to aggressions, right? So basically, when you watch aggressions and violence act on TV, it make the thoughts about aggressions and violence more cognitively accessible. And so, because those thoughts are more accessible, we're more likely to think it, and it's more likely to translate into actual behavior. So, in a longitudinal studies of 700 families that researchers follow for 17 years, they measure, the amount of TV the adolescent teenagers in the family watch, and then they also measure how much sort of aggressive, violent act against others these teenagers years later would commit. And they find that the more TV watching in adolescent there are there were, the more violence these teenagers would commit against others as an adult. Here's another findings. The amount of TV viewing at age from low, medium, and high would predict the seriousness of criminal acts committed by these kids growing up at age 30. So that is pretty alarming. So what is the experimental evidence for media creating violence and aggressions? So one of the experiments on this topic is conducted by Bushman and Anderson on violent video games. So for their independent variable, they assign participants to play in a violent game or non-violent video games. And for their dependent variables, they measure participants' thoughts, emotions, and behaviors. Imagine hypothetical behaviors, of course, in response to a hypothetical scenario. So participants would be asked to read a scenario where they were insulted or they were in sort of a situation that might trigger aggression. And then the researcher would measure, how much aggressive thought, aggressive emotions, and aggressive behavior the participant says that they would think, feel, and do in such a hypothetical scenario. So the results show that when participants play violent game, they have, more aggressive thoughts, more aggressive feelings such as, sort of anger, and they would say or do more aggressive things. So this suggests that playing violence video games increasing the likelihood that someone would have more aggressive thoughts. Right, their aggressive thought might be more cognitively accessible to them. They would feel more aggressive emotions, and those two factors might sort of instigate more aggressive behaviors as an outcome. So with that, this is our essay options number 1. All right, so this is our learning outcome number 5. Let's talk about gender and aggression. Which gender is more aggressive? Well, if you say man or woman or male or female, you're partly right. So men are typically more physically aggressive than females. However, females typically show more relational aggressions than males, and which involve behaviors such as gossiping, backbiting, spreading false rumor, or sunning somebody socially. However, you know, when there is provocation, such as when there's frustration or taunting from somebody else, these gender differences become much smaller. So there's still a difference, but it becomes a lot smaller. When frustrated or like insulted, both gender probably react with aggressions in a similar amount. So what would explain these gender differences? Why why do men act more physically aggressively than women? So you might think about biological differences, right? Men have higher testosterone, the hormone that is tightly linked to aggressions, competitiveness, and like dominant behavior that involve like seeking status and dominating over other people. So these biological factors will explain why men are more physically aggressive. Um, how about some evolutionary explanations? Right? It's possible that in our evolutionary past, um, men engaged in more aggressive behavior, such as defending, hunting, and fighting, whereas our female ancestors tend to sort of do more gathering in hunter-gathering society. Right? Might do more gathering or child rearing, caretaking. Of course, there's evidence showing that in other group of hunter gathering, um, in some groups, women do participate in hunting. But this is sort of like thought exercise about what in our evolutionary past might have sort of leads to divergence in men's and women aggressive behavior. Um, there could be an element of social learning. For example, boys are, in society, boys are more likely to be reinforced for being aggressive than girl, right? If a boy, act aggressively or in a sort of anti-social behavior, um, causing a mess, what do people say? Well, boys will be boys, right? In contrast, if girls act out with aggression, they might be discouraged from repeating those behavior. They might be, admonished or told not to do that again, right? To sort of behave. Um, so there's some evidence that in first grade, the most aggressive boys are typically the most popular one. On the other hand, girls who sort of successfully use non-physical aggressions, such as relational aggressions, um, enacting behavior that sort of give her an edge, give them an edge in social relationships, might also gain social benefits. So there could be a lot of factors that come into play that influence gender differences in aggressive behavior. All right, let's talk about cultural and regional differences in aggressions. So there's this interesting statistic. The homicide rates of white southern males are higher than white northern males, especially in the rural areas in the south. What happened here? More specifically, these homicide rates only apply to argument-related homicides. That is, homicide in response to like insults and offense. Um, this means that in general, in the South, people are not, they don't endorse violence more than in the North. They endorse violence at the same rate. The rate of homicide is the same for other kind of homicide. It's just higher for argument-related homicide in the South. So what happened here? So the psychologists Richard Nisbett and Dov Cohen sort of study this phenomenon, and then they realized and they discovered that the differences on homicide rates related to argument is due to a culture of honor in the South. So how do they test these hypotheses? In one of their study in 1996, they assigned participants to two different conditions. So they recruit northern participants and then southern participants in two different universities. And so all participants go through either one of the conditions. In one condition, they sort of get bumped by a Confederate, and then the Confederate sort of just like apologize, sorry. Right. In the other conditions, in the insulting condition, the participant will get bumped by a Confederate, but this time the Confederate sort of like cursed them out, saying something mean. And then the researcher measure a variety of behavior and biological measures. They measure physiological sign of being upset. They measure testosterone, aggressive, dominant behavior afterward. And what they find is, here's one of the graphs that show the result. What they find is that for the southern participants, right, when they were insulted and bumped by another Confederate, their testosterone level shot up. Right? And again, testosterone is highly linked to aggressive behavior. The researcher also find that these southern participants exhibit greater physiological sign of being upset. They engage afterward in more aggressive and dominant behavior. For example, they would give firmer handshakes. And they were less likely to yield to a subsequent Confederate when both sort of walk into each other in a narrow hallway. So basically this showed that Southern participants, and I forgot to mention in this study they recruited white men. Right? So Southern white men is more likely to react with aggressions to insult. So what explained this? What explained this is a culture of honor in the South, and what it means is that the culture of honor is a culture in which a person would feel applies to protect his or her reputations when they encounter insults by using aggression and violence and other sort of aggressive means to fight back. Right? So in response to insults, Southerner typically would feel that their masculinity was being threatened, and specifically to Southern white men. They would experience higher rise in cortisol level, and cortisol is a hormone that is a stress hormone, so it indicates they experience higher stress. They experience higher testosterone level rises, and they would so engage in aggressive and dominant behavior afterward to basically protect their honor after they have been insulted. And with that, this is our essay option number 2. All right, so that's it for this module.